The Colorado Rockies have one of the best fan bases in sports, one of the best stadiums in sports, and even though they're one of the younger teams in the majors, they've had a few incredible players, a couple Hall of Famers already from their organization, and they made a World Series in 2007. They had a healthy run of playoff teams in the late 2010s, but since then, they've been in a long stage rebuild. They're starting to inch closer towards contention as they have a few Major League ready, really solid young players on the roster, but they lost over 100 games last season and are projected to lose more this year. Let's take a deep dive into this 2025 Colorado Rockies organization. Before I get into the numbers on the screen here, I want you to know that all of these are objective. I'll be putting my formula for these rankings in the description of this video, and that formula came out with an MLB roster that ranked 27th last season, although there are definitely some bright spots here. The Major League lineup was 20th in baseball, and the defense was 12th in baseball. A couple really solid defenders on this team, and some above-average bats. A couple guys that really broke through offensively last year and helped the Rockies be a top two-thirds lineup in baseball. Pitching has historically been an area of struggle for the Rockies. They play in the biggest hitters park in all of baseball, the Major League Baseball team with the highest elevation for their stadium, and a place where pitches don't move the same as they do in other areas. The combination of this and not the best athletes in the rotation and bullpen led to them being ranked 29th and 30th respectively. Where you get a lot of hope for that moving forward though is the 5th ranking in the minor league pitchers section. They have some studs coming through the system, a couple high draft picks and a couple guys that will contribute to the major league roster this year. They also come in at 20th with the minor league hitters. Though not ranked as high as I feel they should be, there's some guys that'll grow into contributors down the road. This puts their overall farm system at 14th, so they're in the upper half of these rankings in 2025. As I mentioned, last season the Rockies were 61-101, last in the NL West and last in the National League. One thing about the Rockies is they will spend money on their baseball product. $146 million in payroll last year, that puts them right below the halfway point in the entire league. The PECOTA projections does not really like the team this year. Projected 55 and 107th, again, last place in the West, last place in the National League, and a 0.0% playoff chance. They had a couple contracts clear the books last year, so their 2025 payroll is down to $110 million. I think we'll see that number go up a little bit every season into the future. An area where the Rockies can really capitalize and really push this rebuild forward this year is their top 100 draft capital. They have picks number 4, 45, 76, and 78 this season. In a draft that's pretty solid, they should get one of the better players in the entire draft and then a few really good developmental pieces to help out with an already good farm system. In terms of their top contracts, their big one is Kris Bryant. Brought in from the Chicago Cubs a few years ago, he's making $27 million this year, and he hasn't given the Rockies much of a contribution since he's came over. I'm personally a bit hopeful for some type of a bounce-back season from Kris Bryant this year. While I don't think he'll end up being Chicago or even San Francisco Kris Bryant, I think we can get a major league average or above average hitter. Kyle Freeland was given a $16 million per year extension after a couple pretty solid years in the past. He's been below league average the past few years, again in a tough hitter's park in Coors Field. Ryan McMahon finally at the bottom making $12 million this year, also got an extension, and he's a pretty solid player. He's your third baseman here for Colorado, and he's been a league average or above hitter in a place where it is pretty hard to get to those numbers. The reasoning for that is the park factor, which you see on the screen at 112. League average for park factor is 100, so the Rockies are 12 above that given the elevation in Colorado and the dimensions of their stadium combined. This park factor number will go into every single statistic calculated with park factor, things like weighted runs created plus and ERA plus or minus. So you have to have a very good offensive season in Coors Field to be league average or above. With that being said, you could have a below average season pitching and still end up being a league average player because of how the park factor works out. Last season, the Rockies were very good at the AA and high A level with a 76-60 and 79-51 record. The Albuquerque Isotopes really struggled in AAA last year, and the Fresno Grizzlies were just above 500 at a 67-64 record. I'll go in quickly to the manager and senior vice president and GM. Bud Black's your manager. He's been here for 9 seasons. He was part of those Rockies playoff teams. 537 and 657, a 450 winning percentage with the Rockies, and a career 464 winning percentage, winning over 1,100 games in his entire career as a manager. He's a solid guy, a guy who's liked a lot around league circles. I don't think he's your long-term manager. He's somebody that they'll probably move on from later. And then Bill Schmitz in his 4th season as a senior vice president and general manager Doesn't have a great record with Colorado, a 387. Winning percentage in 0 playoff appearances. He was actually promoted from inside Colorado's front office, so he's a guy who's been around for a pretty long time. Kind of a quiet offseason for the Rockies, and there wasn't really much to do for them, although they could have done some more. Thairo Estrada was brought in to be their starting second baseman, and he'll be a pretty solid guy here, projected 1.4 WAR in 2025. Kyle Farmer was brought in as another veteran, projected 0.3 WAR, a good lefty hitter, a guy who's been bouncing around for a while. Owen Miller acquired in a trade with Milwaukee, more as organization depth, and Jimmy Herget acquired to potentially be in this bullpen for Colorado this year. They did lose a couple guys to free agency. Brendan Rodgers went over to Houston. He gave just under 1 WAR in 2024. Cal Quantrill went to Miami, half a WAR in 24. Charlie Blackmon is really the big one here. He's been around for a really long time in Colorado. He retired. And a couple pitchers in Peter Lambert and Daniel Bard also leaving in free agency. I will mention for anyone who's not familiar with it, WAR stands for wins above replacement, and it's really the value that they bring in wins to your team above a replacement level player, somebody that can be called up from AAA or picked up off of waivers at any time from any major league club. In this offseason, they brought in and lost around the same amount of WAR. Getting into minor league deals, they signed Austin Nola, Keston Hiura, Nick Martini, and then a bunch of pitchers here. Tommy Doyle, Diego Castillo, Jeffrey Yan, one of the coolest strikeout celebrations you'll ever see in your life. The guy has so much fire in his game. Jake Woodford, and then Jack O'Loughlin here to be depth pieces. As someone who's watched Keston Hiura a lot, I think he's a good fit in Colorado, and he might end up coming up and helping this year. Austin Nola, I would expect to be on the roster. Diego Castillo could probably end up on this roster at some point. Yan might make it out of spring training, given what he's shown so far, and then a couple other pitchers that could be depth options for the organization. In 2025, the biggest storyline for me is the Doyle and Tovar show. These are two really good young players, a center fielder and a shortstop with a lot of pedigree, two incredible defenders who both had pretty solid offensive seasons last year. If they can take a step forward in the offensive department or even give you the same, you feel pretty good about the players that they can be moving forward. Alongside that, I have veteran health. A lot of guys from the Rockies who were brought in last year or in recent years have missed a lot of games. Guys like Chris Bryant, pictured here, really could mean a lot in terms of what this team brings to the table. Finally, franchise direction. The Rockies for a long time now have kind of been middling in between rebuild, contention, and just kind of mediocrity. There's some guys on the roster who they could get a lot for at the trade deadline, guys like Ryan McMahon, pictured here, and a lot of young players who could end up being positives in a full rebuild. I would like to see them kind of pick a direction in 2025, although I wouldn't say I'm super optimistic in seeing that happening. I'll explain a couple of the numbers here first before I go into anything. Think about WOBA as on-base percentage, but it's weighted. Meaning a home run is weighted more than a triple, which is weighted more than a double. That stands for weighted on base average, and it's a better comprehensive statistic than on base percentage. A rule of thumb for WOBA, if it would be a good on base percentage, it would be a good WOBA. League average for that stat is 310. Weighted runs created plus is the other stat on here. The league average for that is 100. A rule of thumb for that, every single stat with a plus next to it is going to be averaged out at 100. Everything above or below that number is going to be the percentage better or worse that they are compared to league average. And this stat I would think of as another comprehensive offensive statistic. Even better than WOBA because it captures things like park factor. It's just a general tool to figure out how good of a player you are offensively. Unfortunately for the Rockies, they only have one player that's above average in weighted runs created plus. Doyle, Tovar, and McMahon are all expected to bring in pretty good WAR. A lot of that is going to be derived from their defensive and base running performances. But I do think for this team, a lot of these numbers are really conservative. This isn't over a full 162. These are a lot different for every individual player. I think guys like Tolia, Estrada, Doyle, and Tovar could all overperform the numbers that they're projected here and give you a better output offensively. They have guys like Sam Hilliard and Jacob Stallings taking a pretty big step back over a bigger sample in 2025. Chris Bryant not giving you much offensively and actually negative WAR, and a lot of guys here that really aren't bringing a lot of value. I think I have a little more hope for this offense than the projections do, but I think if you get some of these numbers here, like 26 homers out of Tovar, 23 out of Doyle, you feel pretty solid about where they're at. On the bench, we have Hunter Goodman, Kyle Farmer, Jordan Beck, and Drew Romo. All of the numbers in parentheses for them is going to be their projected WAR, so not a lot coming from these guys. Although Beck, Romo, and Goodman all have some type of prospect pedigree, and I think if they get a bigger sample, they could actually produce pretty well in the majors. Into the rotation here, we have a veteran-heavy group and a group that's projected some pretty rough numbers in 2025. Although that is to be expected, obviously, as I mentioned, you're playing in a very hitter-heavy park. The biggest thing here, they do expect a lot of innings from this rotation. Feltner with 170, Freeland, Gomber, and Marquez with over 150. A group that's not going to strike out a ton of guys, but they're not going to walk a ton of guys either. Pretty solid in the WAR department, having all 5 be over 1. I personally think I'm a little higher on Ryan Feltner than most. I like some of his pitches. I think he's a pretty solid pitcher. Both Marquez and Senzatella are coming back from injuries, so their productivity is kind of up in the air for this season. Gomber projected a 5.17 ERA. That's a little higher than I personally have him. But overall, not the greatest group here. A couple guys that can give you really good seasons, Marquez and Freeland have in the past. I like Feltner a lot. But I think a group that's really going to be overtaken by their minor league pitching staff in the next couple of years. In this Rockies bullpen, there's a couple guys that I actually really like. I'm very high on Seth Halverson. I'm very high on Luis Peralta. Victor Vodnik has really underperformed a lot of his expected numbers in recent years. Angel Chivilli is an interesting guy coming up. Scott Alexander, they just signed in free agency. Lucas Gilbreth, a good lefty to have, and Tanner Gordon as your long option. Tyler Kinley is projected to be your closer here, and while he didn't have the greatest numbers last year, a lot of his underlying stuff liked him more as a pitcher, although he didn't have the greatest sample. Striking out 24% of his batters projected next year would be a plus for him. That's one thing with this bullpen. There are guys that are going to strike you out. Halverson has great stuff. Peralta has good stuff. Vodnik and Chivilli, along with Gilbreth, are all projected over 20% strikeout rate. A lot of these guys do have a high walk rate. The biggest thing here really for the Rockies, you got 4 rookies and 2 guys with less than 3 years of service time in this bullpen. That could be a good thing and it could be a bad thing. Obviously, you like to have some experience at the major league level, but with some of these young guys coming through their system, you really think a shift in philosophy could come with that. Going into 2025, I think I'm really higher on the Rockies than a lot of places in a lot of these areas. I think their bullpen has some good spots. Their lineup, I think, is going to overperform some of their projected stats. And their starters, while it isn't a great group, could have some solid seasons out of them. Before I get into individual player breakdowns, I'll go over some of the numbers that are on these screens. I'll give you the Baseball Savant pages for all of these players, their WAR per 162, weighted runs created plus, your slash line, WOBA, home runs, and stolen bases. Remember, league average for WOBA is 310, league average WRC plus is 100. All of these numbers on the screen at Baseball Savant are going to be underlying hitting, fielding, and running metrics. Things like xWOBA, xBA, and xSlug are all going to be your expected numbers. You're going to have your average exit velocity, your rates, your barrel rates, hard hit rates. Launch angle sweet spot is the amount of time you hit the ball between 8 and 24 degrees. You'll have your strikeout and walk rates along with your chase and whiff. And then finally, some really good defensive and speed numbers. I'll have your splits against both sides. All of the numbers here on the left side, the offense, BSR, and defense, are all going to be your offense, base running, and defense run values, and I'll give you to that in percentiles if they qualify. And then finally, the free agent year will be on there. So at the catcher position for the Rockies, you have a nice mix of veteran leadership and youth. Jacob Stallings here, 35 years old. He had a really solid season offensively last year, 14% above league average, 9 home runs in 82 games. He hit lefties really well last year, and I think he'll definitely be in the lineup every day against lefties. He's a much better catcher at blocking than framing and throwing runners out, although he's above average in pop time. He has the worst sprint speed in all of baseball, so you're not getting anything there out of him. The expected numbers didn't necessarily love him last year, although he hits the ball where he should. The launch angle sweet spot is really high, and the walk rate's pretty high. He'll be in Colorado until 2026. And then going over to Drew Romo, a switch-hitting catcher, a young guy who had pretty solid minor league stats but struggled in the majors last year in 16 games. In the minors last year in Albuquerque, an 838 OPS and 14 home runs in 85 games, so there is some potential for offense here. The 35th overall pick in 2020 and one of very few high school catchers that are ever selected in the upper rounds. He's an average to an above average defender who didn't give a great sample offensively when he was up, although it was very small, just 16 games. None of the expected numbers really liked him as much either, but there's been a track record of top prospects that have came up and struggled right away. Let's see what he can do in 2025. He's not a free agent until 2030. He's currently the number 8 prospect in the Rockies system, according to MLB Pipeline. Michael Toglia at first base here for the Rockies, a switch hitter, a really interesting player. He hasn't given you much value at the majors yet, negative .8 WAR per 162 since he's been up, but he was 19 points higher than league average in WOBA last year. He had 25 home runs in 116 games and a pretty solid slash line for a 26-year-old that's just getting his first run in the majors. The expected numbers absolutely love this guy. Top 10th percentile in expected WOBA, expected slugging, average exit velocity, barrel rate, hard hit rate, and launch angle sweet spot. And he walks in the top 8th percentile in all of baseball. He's not going to give you a lot defensively or as a runner. 64th percentile in run value as a base runner though, so while he's not super fast, he's a good base runner. He hits lefties a tick better than he does righties. He slugs a lot more as a right-handed hitter. And if he can do anything to cut those whiff rates, chase rates, and K rates down by a decent amount, I think he can be a really good player. A really good first baseman and a nice young addition to this team. He won't be a free agent until 2029. He has yet to reach arbitration yet, so he's not going to make a ton of money anytime soon either. He's a nice, young, cost-controlled player for the Rockies, and I really like his numbers. I think he could take a big step forward in 2025. Moving to second base, you have one of your more underrated pickups in the entire offseason and a guy who's been a really valuable player when he's been on the field in recent years. The reason why he didn't get a lot of hype in the offseason is because of how much he struggled offensively in 2024. He's a great defender at second base, 94th percentile in outs above average at the position, and 70th percentile in sprint speed to go along with that. He's never been a great hitter, a 731 OPS and a 722 OPS in the last 2 seasons, but if he can give you a full season with great defense and great speed, I think that's a big positive for the Rockies. Their philosophy in recent years has been get as much value on the field as you can defensively. In 2023, he was 100th percentile in range at second base. He took a pretty big step back against lefties last year as well, and he dealt with some injuries over the season that could have played into his performance. If Estrada can be closer to a league average bat than he was in 2024, give you something offensively to go along with the great defense and the above average base running, he could be a really valuable player. You see 3 wins above replacement per 162 since 2022. There will be some minor league options coming up through the system that we'll talk about later also that could be at this position, but for now, Thairo Estrada is going to be your starting second baseman. At third base, you have really your best vet on the team in Ryan McMahon, a good lefty third base bat that is a great defender. Has always been an above average fielder at third base and brings you a ton of value in that department. Alongside this, he's great at hitting the ball hard. 93rd percentile in hard hit rate, 91st in average exit velocity. While he does whiff and strike out a decent amount, he has a plate approach where he's going to hit the ball hard when he makes contact with it. 20 home runs, just above league average in WOBA last year. He was 11% below average offensively as a hitter, but per 162 since 2022, 2.4 wins above replacement. McMahon has an extension through 2028, so he'll be your third baseman here for a bit. He's a pretty solid hitter against lefties too as a left-handed bat, which is nice to have. He's playable every single game, and he does play most games, 153 games last season. I think McMahon is due for a bit of positive regression with his numbers in 2024, just considering all of the hard hit numbers that he has. He's a guy who walks a lot, he gets on base at a pretty solid clip, 30 years old, and overall just a really solid third base option. We've seen his name kind of come up in some trade rumors, although the Rockies did just give him an extension. I personally think he's probably going to be here for the long haul. Ezequiel Tovar is a young, former top prospect who really took a step forward offensively with the counting numbers last year. 26 home runs in 157 games. He was just over league average in offensive run value, and he's an incredible defender. 94th percentile in defensive run value in 2024. He brought his average exit velocity last season up 23%. That raised the expected slugging and expected WOBA numbers, but along with that came a little bit more strikeout, which you don't like to see as much. He's a guy who really doesn't walk at all, which is kind of a tough thing to have on your profile, down to 3.3% last year. But having a guy with this great of defense and this good a pop at the shortstop position is definitely a net positive. 2.6 WAR per 162 since he's been called up, and a 7-year, $63.5 million extension was given to him before the season last year. The Rockies really believe in this guy. They see him as their future shortstop. I think he's a really fun player, a great defender. You don't love the K rate and the walk rate It's never been very high for him, but being a guy who's just 23 years old, already shown he has 25 plus homer power at the major league level at shortstop. I really enjoy watching Ezequiel Tovar play, specifically on defense. I think he even has more potential as a base runner as well that he hasn't tapped into. Just a really solid young shortstop that does a lot of things really well. He'll be here until 2031 if all things go right, and this is really the biggest piece in the Rockies rebuild. The lefty hitting Nolan Jones is your left fielder here, and he's a guy who had a great 2023 followed by a really bad 2024. Struggled with some injuries all year, never really got it going offensively. There are a couple numbers that still really like him. The fielding department, he has a great arm, and he's still decent in sprint speed. In 2023, a 931 OPS, he was 93rd percentile in batting run value. 85th in expected WOBA, 88th in expected slugging. His barrel rate was way up there. Just really a step back from Nolan Jones in 2024. A couple reasons why I'm still pretty high on him going forward. His walk rate is still really good. Even though he only hit 227 last year, he still had a 321 on base, which is really solid. I'm hoping that a full bill of health in 2025 and a full season will kind of help some of these problems go away that he had last year. Even though he struck out a lot and whiffed a lot still in 2023, his barrel rate was way higher, and I think that's something that can come back, and I do expect it to come back a little bit. He got a bit better post-All-Star last year, a 673 OPS compared to a 624 in the first half. He took a pretty big step back last year, both against lefties and righties, but an even bigger step back against lefties. He has shown that he can hit them in the past, over a 900 OPS against him in 2023. So I think there's some hope for Nolan Jones in 2025. Although I don't know if we're going to get the 2020 full season, 424 at-bats, 931 OPS out of him that we got in 2023. He's a player I'm a bit higher on. A guy who had a lot of injuries and just didn't really get going in the majors last year. I think he can bounce back in 2025. Brenton Doyle is your center fielder, and if you've never heard of this guy before because he played in Colorado, you have to watch him play. 23 homers, 30 stolen bases last year, 96th percentile in base running, 99th percentile in defense. He absolutely flies in the outfield. He takes great angles at balls. He has a great arm, and he's just so fast out there. He's such a great defender in center field. Doyle's always been a great defender. He was 100th percentile in fielding run value last year. But the reason that he is now such a valuable player is because how huge of a step forward he took last year offensively. He raised his on base percentage by almost 70 points, his slug by almost 130 points. He really started hitting the ball in the air last year. 81st percentile launch angle sweet spot percent in 2024 compared to just 11th percentile in 2023. Last year, he took a bit of a step back after the All-Star break, down to a 681 OPS from an 814 in the first half, but some of the numbers were still there. Still had 8 home runs in that second half, and a 681 OPS from a guy who gives you this much defensively and as a runner is still a huge net positive. If Doyle can take another step forward, maybe cut down his strikeouts a bit, maybe walk more, do a couple things better, he could be one of the most valuable players in all of baseball. The Rockies really went after building this lineup with high floor players, guys that are good fielders and good base runners, and Doyle is the poster boy of that. He'll be out in center field every single day for the Rockies next year, and he's just a great player. 149 games last season, just one of the more fun baseball players to watch. Now in right field, you got Sam Hilliard, a guy who's been on the Rockies in the past, left, and then came back. He ended up being one of the few players on this team who was a positive offensively compared to league average last year. 7% better in 2024 in those 58 games. The Rockies really like this guy, and there's a couple reasons why. One of the best average exit velocities in all of baseball, one of the best arms in all of baseball, and one of the fastest players in all of baseball to go along with that. He has a lot of swing and miss in his game. 35.4% K rate. He whiffs on 41% of his swings, but he does walk a decent amount, just about 9% on the walk rate. I think this is pretty far and away the highest variance player on the Rockies. A guy who, if he goes out there, could give you 30 home runs, but lead the league in strikeouts. I don't know if he'll get full run in right field this year. There's a couple guys coming up through the system, a couple guys even on the roster right now that could fight for this spot. But the Rockies really like this player, and it's really easy to see why once you look at some of these metrics. At DH, you have your highest paid player on the roster, Chris Bryant. He's 33 years old. Since 2022, that is not a typo, negative 1.4 wins above replacement. So he's actually brought more of a negative value to this team than a replacement level player would. He was limited to just 37 games last year, 30% worse than league average offensively. He did take a bit of a step forward when he played post-All-Star last year, 54 plate appearances, a 692 OPS compared to that 586 in the first half. 33-year-old Kris Bryant isn't really going to give you anything defensively or base running. He'll most likely be your all-time DH here. He had a solid run in the Rockies with 2022. Again, only 181 plate appearances, but an 851 OPS, some really good walk rate, strikeout rate numbers. Former number 2 overall pick of the Chicago Cubs and MVP. I think the biggest thing with Kris Bryant, a lot of guys that you see get big contracts and, not end up producing kind of seem like they mail it in and just don't really give you as much effort, I guess, as most players usually do or as they did in the past. It doesn't really seem like Bryant's been doing that. He just has been getting really unlucky with injuries, and that's really hampered his performance. Knock on wood, because he hasn't had anywhere near really a full season in the past couple of years. But I think if he gets a full year, he could maybe give you something. I'm hoping he's not a negative value player like he has been in the past years. Maybe just being a DH and just sitting there and going out and getting your at-bats could lead to some production for the Rockies. He's still here until 2029, so the Rockies are probably going to keep throwing him out there every day, even if he doesn't give you a lot. It's a tough contract right now, but I'm hoping for a bit of a step forward from Kris Bryant in 2025. On the bench here, we have 2 younger guys and 1 older utility player in Kyle Farmer. Hunter Goodman is a catcher/outfielder. I really like these archetypes of player. The problem with him, he's been really not valuable at the major league level. Negative 2.6 WAR per 162 since he came over. Just kind of a common theme with this team is there's a lot of guys that you feel like can give you more but just haven't in the past. We'll see what Hunter Goodman can bring in 2025. Next, you move into Kyle Farmer. He was brought in on a free agent deal this offseason, and he has been a pretty valuable player in the past. Not as much last year, just 85 weighted runs created plus, but he hits lefties really well. 1.5 WAR per 162. He was about a league average hitter the past 2 years and gave you double-digit home runs. He'll mostly play second base and third base, and I would expect him to get a decent amount of at-bats on this team. Now going to the highest variance player here, Jordan Beck. He's been a big prospect for the Rockies. Last year he was ranked number 81 in the top 100 by MLB Pipeline. Last season in the minor leagues, a 935 OPS in AAA. 8 home runs in 42 games. His run in the majors was not very good at all. He was 68% below league average as a hitter. The thing with him that is really nice, he's a great defender and he's very fast. Another kind of one of these high floor guys that the Rockies are bringing up through their system. He'll be playing in the outfield, I think fighting for that right field spot more than anything. 3 righties currently on the bench for the Rockies. They do have a lot of lefties in their lineup, and the projected lineups are just going to be your lineups against right-handed hitters, so I would expect a bit of a fluctuation with their team from righties to lefties. Farmer and Goodman will most likely be in there against left-handed pitching. German Marquez is your number 1 starter in this rotation, and since he really hasn't gotten any run at the major league level since 2022 due to some injuries, I'm giving you the stats from that season. Just 24 innings in 2023 and 2024 combined. He's been an all-star for the Rockies in the past, a pretty solid 2021, 2020, and 2018 season for the team. He's had seasons with wins above average of 3.4, 2.3, 3.3, 4.1, and 2.4 over full years. He's always been more of a breaking ball pitcher. His breaking pitches are very good. He hasn't had an above average fastball since 2019, so we'll see what he can do with that this year. He will be a free agent after this season and maybe a trade candidate for the Rockies if he gets off to a good start. But he's a guy who's been up in the majors since 2016 with Colorado, and he's really been their best pitcher since 2017. I would like to see Marquez get a full season. Hopefully he's feeling good after his injuries. The fastball velocity actually went up in 2024 compared to 2022 and 2023 since he came back. I'm hopeful for a solid 2025 from German Marquez. So the second starter here is Ryan Feldner. I mentioned him before as a guy I liked. He's really underperformed his expected numbers the past couple of years. Last season, a 4.49 ERA, but a 4.16 FIP. We would expect those numbers usually to be much closer. Last season, 2.4 WAR for the Rockies. He gave you 162 innings. And a number for him, it might not be easy to understand, but ERA minus is a stat kind of like weighted runs created plus, but below league average is actually better. Last season, he had a 96 ERA minus, so he was 4% better than league average in 2024. It just didn't show up in his numbers. A lot of that has to do with pitching at Coors Field. Again, a really tough park to pitch in, but some of his pitches are really interesting. His breaking pitches and off-speed pitches were both positive run value in 2023. They took a step back in 2024 over a bigger sample. And he actually did a pretty solid job in 23 of limiting hard contact, average exit velocity, barrel rate, and hard hit rate in top 15th percentile. Not as good in 2024, but still solid. He's a guy who I think can be really good and maybe the only potential long-term option out of this current rotation. He's a 6-pitch guy too as well. He's got a 4-seam, a slider, a change, a sinker, a curve, and a sweeper. I would hope that he can generate a bit more swing and miss on his pitches and maybe get that strikeout rate up a little bit from last year. He's not a free agent until 2029, so he'll be around for a while. I think Feltner is going to be a guy to give you innings out of this rotation for sure this season. So we'll go into Kyle Freeland here. He's the guy, the second highest contract in this organization. He hasn't really been good since 2022, although he has given you 2 WAR in the past 2 seasons. A 5.24 and a 5.03 ERA those last 2 years. Even the couple years before that, his ERA was in the mid to high 3s. He made his money after a really solid year in 2018, 4.1 WAR, a 2.85 ERA. That ERA minus number that I mentioned, 62, so he was 38% better than league average that year by ERA. When Freeland's good, he has a good fastball and good breaking pitches. He hasn't really had that at all since 2018. 99th percentile in fastball run value, 91st in breaking run value. I know it's crazy to even talk about it because it's 9 years ago, but I think there's still a little bit of that pitcher in here. He was a first-round pick, again, 2014, 11 years ago. Freeland's still only 31. You're putting him out there mostly for innings at this point. He gave you 113 last year, but over 100 the past couple years as well. Biggest thing for Freeland, he's not a super high ceiling guy right now, but he can go out there and give you innings every 5th day. Antonio Senzatella is your 4th guy in this rotation. Him and Marquez both have been dealing with injuries the past couple of years. I gave you the 2024 ranks because that's a bit more of what you're going to see next year. Just not a great pitcher right now. Last year, only 12.1 innings. It's really hard to make any assumptions from that small of a sample. He's given you 20 innings in the past 2 years dealing with injuries. In 2022, he was solid. His numbers didn't really show that. He had a 5.07 ERA, but a 4.05 FIP, a 3.61 the year before. His fastball velocity is around the same, so you would expect to have more of that moving forward. He had a 3.5 WAR in 2021, a pretty good season there, but the last 2 years he's been negative in value for the team. Even when Senzatella was good, a lot of his value derived from him not walking a ton of guys, but he didn't really strike out anyone either, 15.7% K rate. He's a free agent in 2027, and he's another one of these guys that I could kind of see being pushed out of the rotation by some of these younger pitchers coming up. Austin Gomber is your 5th starter, and he came over in the Nolan Arenado trade a couple years ago. 30 starts in 2024, 165 innings. Similarly to Senzatella, he's kind of a guy that doesn't walk a ton. He's not going to strike out a ton. The baseball savant numbers really didn't like him at all. 2023 was a very similar page, also a 5.5 ERA at 27 starts and 139 innings. In 22, we had some interesting numbers. The off-speed run value was at an 86. He didn't give up as much hard contact. But really, I'll say it again, Gomber is more out here to be a guy who can give you innings. If you can get a 4.75 ERA out of him or maybe a little less, I think you feel pretty good. He had 1.2 WAR last season, 0.9 the 2 years before that. He was solid in 2021. That was 4 years ago. Kind of a common theme with this rotation. They've had seasons before, but they haven't been great since. He gave you 165 innings last year. Let's see if he can go out there and give you more. But again, not a super high ceiling guy. He's a free agent after this season. So like a couple of these guys I mentioned before, I would kind of expect him to get pushed out by some of this young pitching coming up. Luckily for the Rockies, we do have a pretty fun bullpen here. Tyler Kinley is your closer, 34 years old, struck out 25% of the guys he saw last year. I think he's going to make a step forward in 2025. A whiff rate in the 93rd percentile, a hard hit rate in the 88th percentile. He limits hard contact pretty well, and he strikes guys out. In 2022, Kinley had a .75 ERA in 24 innings, and in that season, it was a lot of the same for him. He just had a much lower barrel rate comparatively to last year. He's going to strike out a lot of guys. He's not going to walk a ton, so I think there could be some positive here. I do like these two next guys a bit better though, and Seth Halverson might be the most underrated reliever in baseball. Although we got a very small sample last year, 99th percentile in fastball velo, and then top 15th percentile in walk rate, K rate, whiff rate, expected batting average, and expected ERA. All three of his pitching types, the fastball, the breaking, and the off-speed, were plus value pitches, and in just 12.1 innings, he generated a 4 pitching run value. He actually was a lot better in the majors last year. The PCL is a very high run environment, along with the Double-A league that he played with, but he still had a 4.47 ERA in 44.1 innings there. Alongside that, though, 56 strikeouts. This is definitely a guy to watch in 2024, and I think this is probably your future closer. Luis Peralta, brother of Freddie Peralta, coming in here, 24 years old, 26.6% strikeout rate, 12.1 innings last year, gave up 0 home runs, a .73 ERA. His fastball was great last year. In just 12.1 innings, generated 6 on the fastball run value. Great numbers in barrel rate, K rate, expected batting average, and expected ERA. One thing that's interesting about Peralta, he doesn't get a ton of whiffs or chases. Pretty low in the chase rate and whiff rate category. I think we might see those numbers come up a little. It was a really small sample last year. I'll mention the fastball and the curveball last year were very good. A 235 wOBA on the fastball and a 248 on the curveball, so 2++ pitches. I think this is a bullpen that could be pretty solid this year. Specifically, these two guys on the right, both 25 and 24 years old, a couple fun young flamethrowers out of this Rocky bullpen. Victor Vodnik is another one of these fun relievers for the Rockies. Gave up a lot of hard contact last year, but his fastball velo is in the 97th percentile, ground ball rate at 91st percentile. The off-speed run value was 7 last year, so that's in the top 6 percentile in all of baseball. He had okay numbers. His FIP was a bit lower than his ERA. His expected numbers didn't really like him as much last year, but I think there's something there. He could be a good pitcher, a nice righty, and a hard thrower out of this bullpen. Angel Chivilli, just 22 years old, came up for the Rockies last year, a 4.55 ERA in 31.2 innings. He had chase and whiff rates that were amongst the best in baseball. He does a good job of keeping the ball on the ground. He had solid off-speed pitches. His fastball and breaking pitches got hit pretty well last year. He doesn't walk a ton of guys, but he doesn't strike out a ton of guys yet either. I think that's something that could change next year because the chase and whiff rates were so good. I think we expect that strikeout rate to go up a bit. Scott Alexander just brought over from the A's a couple days ago in free agency, a 2.56 ERA in 38.2 innings last season. He's another one of these crafty lefty types that keeps the ball on the ground. He's not going to throw super hard, not going to strike out a ton of guys, not going to walk a ton of guys, but he plays really well to this Rockies defense, and I think this was a really solid addition for the Rockies. Lucas Gilbreth only had 1 inning pitched last year and missed all of 2023, so I have his 2022 stats up here. In 22, Gilbreth did really well limiting barrels and getting strikeouts and whiffs. He has a pretty high walk rate though, and he's going to be bringing in just about 70% of fastballs. So finally, Tanner Gordon as the long man listed by Fangraphs. He actually started all games that he appeared in last year. The numbers weren't great, but the underlying numbers liked him a little more, an expected 5.94 ERA. He only walked 3.8% of the hitters he faced, and he generates chases. A lot of the other areas weren't as great last season. A 4.26 ERA in 13 starts in the minors last year to go along with that. And really more than anything, an innings option out of this bullpen. So the top prospect list here, you got 3 guys in the top 100, 2 in the top 40, 1 in the top 10 in Chase Dollander. A guy who was incredible in college with Tennessee. He got up to Double-A last year. Really does everything well. A 70 fastball, 55 curveball, 60 cutter, 45 changeup, 55 control. He was the 9th overall pick in the 23 draft by the Colorado Rockies, and he's been really solid all throughout his minor league career. Last season, in those 118 innings, 169 strikeouts compared to just 47 walks. A guy I would expect to be up to the major league level at some point this year, and more importantly, probably sooner rather than later. he's a guy that you get really excited about in this rotation for the Rockies in the future. Charlie Condon, the 3rd overall pick in the 2024 draft, and a guy who had outrageous stats at Georgia in college. He can play both third base and corner outfield. He got a little bit of run last season. They sent him right up to high A right when he got drafted. 25 games, a 48 weighted runs created plus, so not a great sample so far. But at Georgia, a 556 on base, a 1.009 slugging, a 614 WOBA, 215% better than the average college hitter in 2024. He's got light tower power, a 70 power grade from Baseball America. He can be a solid fielder at third base. I would expect him again to be up sooner rather than later, though most likely not in 2025. He's still 21 years old and just has run at the high A level. Your third prospect here is Cole Carrig, 22 years old, got up to high A last year and was really good there, 34% better than league average and 17 home runs. He was the 65th overall pick in the 23 draft out of San Diego State. Only struck out 18.9% of the time in the minors last year and walked just about 10%. The most interesting thing about this guy, he's a catcher slash first baseman, but he had 53 stolen bases in the minors last year. So he's a plus speed, plus defender guy who can catch and play first base. Along with that, he's currently listed as an outfielder on Fangraphs, so we could see him out there as well. He's a guy who's really produced in the minors, a 55 future value by Baseball America. And he's got a lot of tools, 60 runs, 60 fields, 70 arm. He should be a fun prospect to pay attention to in 2025. Getting into some notable infield prospects, not a super deep group, but a group that has a couple guys that I like in the higher ranks of their system. Adael Amador got up to the majors last year, wasn't great there. He actually is one of the very few people that you'll ever see with a negative weighted runs created plus. He was -5 last year, 171 average, 194 on base, 200 slugging. This is only in 10 games and 36 plate appearances. I personally just don't think he was ready yet. He's only 21 years old right now, and he never played in AAA. He had great stats in 2023, 144 weighted runs created plus at high A. Last season in AA, 111 weighted runs created plus, so he was still above average. And one thing about him that's really nice, he walked just about 14% of the time and struck out less than 20% of the time. So he's a fun, projectable player who could be a solid bat in the majors. I think he would more than likely be your long-term second base option. Ryan Ritter is next, a 24-year-old prospect who's a great defender and put up some really good numbers in the minors last year. 126 weighted runs created plus in AA, 91 games, 7 homers, and 17 steals. Again, with Ritter, he walks just a tick under 10%. He did strike out a little more than some of these guys at 23.6, but he's another player coming up through the system, one of your older prospects. I would expect to see him in the majors pretty soon. Kyle Karros I have listed here as a number 23 prospect for the Rockies. Not a ton of prospect pedigree, but he was great last year. 145 weighted runs created plus, walked 10% of the time, struck out 22% of the time, 15 homers and 12 steals in 123 games at high A. So GJ Hill, an unranked prospect, 24 years old in high A, but his numbers were great last year. 160 weighted runs created plus, a 423 WOBA. He doesn't walk as much as these guys, and he strikes out a decent amount, so that could be something to monitor. I don't know if he'll ever get up to the majors, but he was really solid last year, and I think if anything, he could be a depth piece in the majors. Kevin Hidalgo, one of the higher ranked prospects here, he had a really solid 22 and 23 in the minors, took a bit of a step back once he got up to A-ball from the complex league. A 96 weighted runs created plus, so he was a little below average offensively, didn't walk a lot, and struck out a decent amount. Yanquiel Fernandez is your first outfielder here for the Rockies, and he's been great across the minors so far. He did get up to AAA last year and struggled a bit, 44 weighted runs created plus in 33 games there. But 120 weighted runs created plus at AA. He had 25 home runs in 2023, 12 last season, so he's a nice power bat in the system with a plus arm. I would expect to see him in the majors this year. Robert Calaz, 19 years old at high A, the number 5 prospect. He's got 70 grade power, 67% better than league average in the minors last year, 145 once he got over to A-ball. He slugged 571 in his 57 plate appearances here and 651 in 210 in the complex league. Not a guy who walks a lot, kind of strikes out a lot. I would keep an eye on him as a young guy moving through this system. Zach Veen's the third dude listed here. If you follow the Rockies at all, you know who he is. And even if you just follow baseball, you've probably heard of him before. He's been one of the higher prospects in the Rockies organization for the past few years. He had a really good 2022, kind of took a step back in 2023 at AA, but again took a step forward in 2024. Ended 18% above league average. He had 11 home runs and 21 steals in 65 games last year. He'll definitely be at the majors in 2025, probably going for that right field spot. Jared Thomas, a 2024 draft pick out of Texas, he got up to A-ball last season, 36 plate appearances. He was 46% better than league average. Great numbers at Texas the last 2 years. A second-round pick who's 21 years old and should be fun to watch moving forward. Let's get into this fun group of pitchers here for the Rockies. Carson Palmquist, a guy who I would expect to be in the majors. He was a third-round pick in 24 years old. Pretty solid numbers last year, a 4.43 ERA, a 3.98 FIP. Struck out over 29% of the batters that he faced last year and just a tick under 12% with the walk rate. Has a good slider, a good changeup, good control. I would like to see him work on his fastball a bit more to end up being a higher potential starter, but I think he'll be in the rotation over the long haul for Colorado. Brody Brecht was the 38th overall pick in the 2024 draft out of Iowa. He has yet to pitch in the Rockies system yet, but he was really good in Iowa for the last 3 years. Strikeout rates of 35%, 33%, and 39% the last 3 seasons. He'll be one to watch over the entire year in 25 and see what the Rockies end up doing with him. At 22 years old, I could see them moving him up pretty quickly in their system. Yuhanier Herrera is unfortunately a pitcher that just underwent Tommy John surgery, but he had a great year last year. 2.79 ERA and 100.2 innings. He has 5 pitches in his arsenal that are a 50 or above on the Baseball America scale, a 55 control, and a 60 slider as his best pitch. He is only 21 years old, so he'll have a lot of time to recover from this injury. He's our number 13 prospect. Keep tabs on him for maybe next season as a pitcher that could break out. Wellington Herrera, another high A pitcher here, 27th prospect, 20 years old. He's a 55 grade fastball and slider, a changeup that needs to develop, and decent control. Great numbers last year, a 268 FIP throughout A and high A, a 13.28 Ks per 9 last year. Finally, we'll get on to Michael Prosecki, another member of this really good high A rotation for the Rockies last year. Fastball and slider both at a 55, control at a 50. Good numbers last year as well. Struck out 14.42 per 9 innings last year. That's a strikeout rate of 36.1%. We will mostly see him, in my opinion, as a reliever moving forward, although he did start 13 out of his 14 games last year. They had him come out of the bullpen one time at high A, and I think if he's a reliever, he would be a really solid one with 2 pretty good pitches. The projected 2028 lineup for the Rockies actually has a crew of guys that are already in the majors to go along with some of this minor league talent. Romo, Tolia, Tovar, Jones, and Doyle are already going to contribute on this major league roster this year. And we'll see that there's a lot of high-ranking guys that are in this lineup. In 2028, Doyle and Jones will still only be 30, and they'll be the oldest guys here. Tolia will be 29. Tovar at 26 in 2028, I think is going to be a great player. This is really a fun lineup for the Rockies. I would expect them to bring in some type of veteran presence at some area, as they do spend some money in free agency, but overall, you have a really good mix of players. Younger guys that will have a lot of service time at that point in their careers. I have a lot of hope for this 2028 Colorado Rockies lineup, and I think moving forward, we'll see a bunch of these guys make their debuts pretty soon. The 2028 rotation and closer is almost brand new outside of Seth Halverson being listed as their closer. We went over Chase Dollander. I think he has all of the makings of a number 1 starter. Palmquist at 2 and Breck at 3. I didn't mention Jordy Vargas. He was a pitcher that didn't have the greatest stats last season, but he's another highly touted prospect. And then Sean Sullivan is your 5 starter here. The really fun thing to notice about this group, all 5 of the starters in 2028 will be under 28 years old. The closer being 28 years old, Luis Peralta, another guy that could be in contention for that closer role considering how Halverson does. I think this is really the window for this Rockies team, 2027 to 2028. You'll start getting a lot of your fun prospects up. They have the number 4 pick in the draft this year. I think this could be the group of pitchers that makes it well in Colorado. A really fun young lineup. and a fun rotation here to close it out. So thank you so much if you're still listening to this video. These videos take a long time to produce and edit and everything, so it means a lot for you guys to listen to this. The Rockies should be a team with some bright spots in 2025, but not necessarily one contending for playoff seeding.